World War II was, well, a massive global conflict. It was honestly the largest and deadliest war in human history. The fighting lasted for 6 long years, from 1939 to 1945, and it involved more than 30 countries from every part of the world. Over 100 million people were put into military service. The war was fought across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the oceans between them. It was a total war, which means it affected not just soldiers on the battlefield, but also ordinary people in their homes. Cities were bombed, and economies were completely focused on the war effort. This conflict reshaped the map of the world and, really, changed the lives of everyone who lived through it. The war was fought between 2 main groups of countries. One side was called the Axis powers. The main Axis countries were Germany, Italy, and Japan. They were led by powerful dictators. Adolf Hitler ruled Germany, Benito Mussolini ruled Italy, and Emperor Hirohito was the head of Japan. These leaders wanted to expand their empires and gain more power. They believed in military strength and aggressive expansion. They signed agreements to support each other in their goals. Their actions created fear and instability across the globe, pushing nations closer to a major confrontation that many had feared since the end of the last Great War. On the other side were the Allied powers. The main Allied countries at the start were Great Britain and France. Later, they were joined by the Soviet Union and the United States. Many other countries also joined the Allies, including Canada, Australia, and China. These nations came together to stop the Axis powers. They wanted to protect their freedom and sovereignty. The leaders of the Allied nations, such as Winston Churchill in Britain and Franklin D. Roosevelt in the United States, knew the fight would be incredibly difficult. They had to mobilize their entire populations and industries for the long struggle that lay ahead. The world in the 1930s was a very unstable place. The memory of World War I, which had ended only 2 decades earlier, was still fresh. People called it the war to end all wars, but peace did not last. Economic problems, like the Great Depression, caused suffering and unrest in many countries. This difficult time allowed extremist leaders to rise to power. They promised simple solutions to complex problems and blamed others for their country's troubles. As these leaders built up their armies and threatened their neighbors, the world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when diplomacy would fail and the fighting would begin once more. The start of World War II was not a single event. It was really the result of many problems that had been growing for years. A major cause was the Treaty of Versailles. This was the peace treaty that ended World War I in 1919. The treaty was very harsh on Germany. It forced Germany to accept all the blame for the First War. Germany had to pay huge sums of money, called reparations, to the winning countries. It also lost a lot of its territory and was forbidden from having a large army. Many Germans felt this was unfair and deeply humiliating, creating a powerful sense of resentment that would fester for years. This feeling of national shame helped Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rise to power in Germany. Hitler was a charismatic speaker who promised to make Germany strong again. He told the German people that they had been betrayed by their leaders and by other countries. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany's honor. In 1933, Hitler became the leader of Germany, known as the Chancellor. He quickly began to rearm the country in secret, building up a powerful army, navy, and air force. This was a direct violation of the treaty, but other countries were slow to react, hoping to avoid another war. Other countries also had aggressive ambitions. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party wanted to build a new Roman Empire. They invaded Ethiopia in Africa in 1935. In Asia, Japan was growing its military power. Japanese leaders wanted to control East Asia and the Pacific. They believed they needed more land and resources for their growing population. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, a brutal conflict that marked the beginning of the war in Asia. These acts of aggression showed that the international system designed to keep peace, the League of Nations, was failing. The policy of appeasement also contributed to the start of the war. Leaders in Britain and France were desperate to avoid another terrible conflict. They believed they could prevent war by giving Hitler some of what he wanted. In 1938, they allowed Germany to take over parts of Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference. They hoped this would satisfy Hitler and bring peace for our time. However, appeasement only made Hitler bolder. He saw that the other powers were not willing to fight him. It convinced him that he could continue his expansion without facing serious opposition, setting the stage for his next and most fateful move. The final trigger for the war in Europe was the invasion of Poland. Adolf Hitler had already taken over Austria and Czechoslovakia without a fight. His next target was Poland. He demanded the return of the city of Danzig, which had been taken from Germany after World War I. He also wanted a road and railway link across a strip of Polish land to connect Germany to East Prussia. Poland refused these demands, determined to protect its independence. Britain and France, realizing that appeasement had failed, promised to defend Poland if it was attacked. This promise set the stage for a major European confrontation. To avoid fighting a war on two fronts, Hitler made a shocking deal with his sworn enemy, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty, meaning neither country would attack the other. Secretly, however, the pact included a protocol to divide Poland between them. This agreement gave Hitler the green light to invade. He no longer had to worry about a Soviet attack from the east, while he was fighting Poland, Britain and France in the west. The path to war was now clear. On September 1st, 1939, the German army launched its invasion of Poland. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombed Polish airfields, railways and cities. At the same time, German tanks and infantry poured across the border from the north, west and south. This new type of warfare was called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It used speed and surprise to crush the enemy quickly. The Polish army fought bravely, but it was no match for the modern and well-equipped German forces. They were outmaneuvered and surrounded, their defences crumbling under the relentless assault. True to their promise, Great Britain and France delivered an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw from Poland or face war. Hitler ignored the warning. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. This marked the official beginning of World War II in Europe. While the Western Allies declared war, they could do little to help Poland directly in time. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, as agreed in the secret pact. Caught between two powerful invaders, Polish resistance collapsed. By the end of the month, Poland was completely conquered and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The war had begun. After the swift conquest of Poland, the war entered a strange, quiet period. This time was known as the Phony War. For several months, there was very little fighting on the Western Front. British and French troops waited behind their defensive lines, while the German army prepared for its next move. Many people hoped that a full-scale war could still be avoided. However, this was just the calm before the storm. Germany was using this time to plan a massive offensive that would change the course of the war and shock the world with its speed and effectiveness. The Allied commanders, meanwhile, seemed unable to grasp the new reality of mobile warfare. In the spring of 1940, the Phony War came to an abrupt end. In April, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. This was done to secure vital iron ore supplies from Sweden and to gain naval bases for operations against Britain. Then on May 10, 1940, the German army launched its Blitzkrieg against Western Europe. German forces attacked the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. The main attack, however, came through the Ardennes forest, an area the Allies had thought was impassable for tanks. This surprise move allowed the Germans to bypass the main French and British defences, the Maginot Line, and race towards the English Channel. The speed of the German advance was, well, absolutely stunning. The Allied armies were thrown into confusion and chaos. They were encircled and cut off. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian soldiers, was trapped on the coast at the French port of Dunkirk. In a desperate and heroic effort, a massive evacuation was organised. Hundreds of military ships, as well as small civilian boats, crossed the English Channel under constant German air attack. This miracle of Dunkirk saved over 338,000 Allied soldiers. However, they had to leave behind all their heavy equipment, and France was left nearly defenceless against the German onslaught. With its main allies defeated or evacuated, France's fate was sealed. German forces swept south, and on June 14, 1940, they entered Paris. The French government was forced to surrender just a few weeks after the invasion began. Germany now controlled most of Western Europe. Great Britain stood alone against the might of Hitler's war machine. Hitler expected Britain to seek peace, but its new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, vowed to fight on. He delivered powerful speeches, promising that Britain would never surrender. The war was no longer just a European conflict. It was a struggle for survival for the remaining free nations. In June 1941, Hitler made a fateful decision that would dramatically change the war. He broke his pact with Stalin and launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This massive operation was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler's goals were to destroy communism, seize the Soviet Union's vast natural resources like oil and grain, and create Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. He believed the Soviet state was weak and would collapse within a few weeks of the attack. Initially, the invasion was a spectacular success. The German blitzkrieg tactics worked just as well as they had in the West. The Soviet Red Army was caught completely by surprise. Stalin had ignored repeated warnings of an impending attack. German forces advanced hundreds of miles deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. They captured millions of prisoners and vast amounts of equipment. Cities like Minsk and Kiev fell. By the autumn of 1941, German troops were on the outskirts of Moscow, the Soviet capital. It seemed as though Hitler's prediction of a swift victory was about to come true. However, the Soviet Union did not collapse. The vast size of the country, its huge population, and the resilience of its people began to slow the German advance. The Soviets moved their factories east of the Ural Mountains, where they could continue to produce tanks and weapons out of reach of German bombers. The brutal Russian winter arrived early and was exceptionally cold. German soldiers were not equipped for the freezing temperatures. Their tanks and trucks broke down, and their weapons froze. The winter gave the Red Army a crucial chance to regroup and launch a counterattack, pushing the exhausted Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The war on the Eastern Front was fought with unimaginable cruelty and brutality. It was a war of ideologies where both sides saw the other as less than human. Millions of soldiers and civilians died in the fighting from starvation and in mass executions. The turning point came at the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from late 1942 to early 1943. After months of savage street fighting, the German Sixth Army was surrounded and forced to surrender. This was a catastrophic defeat for Germany. From that point on, the Red Army began its long, slow and bloody push westward, driving the German army all the way back to Berlin. While the war raged in Europe, tensions were also escalating in the Pacific. Japan continued its aggressive expansion in Asia, seeking to create what they called a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was essentially a Japanese empire. The United States, concerned by Japan's actions, tried to stop them through economic pressure. America placed an embargo on oil and steel exports to Japan. This was a critical blow, as Japan relied heavily on the United States for these resources to fuel its war machine. Faced with a choice between ending its expansion or going to war to secure its own resources, Japan's military leaders chose the path of conflict. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the United States. Japanese carrier planes bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack was devastating. It sank or damaged numerous United States battleships and destroyed hundreds of aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Japan hoped this crippling blow would destroy the United States Pacific Fleet and prevent America from interfering with its conquests in Southeast Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a profound shock to the American people, who had largely hoped to stay out of the war. It ended American isolationism overnight. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States. This act brought America fully into World War II on the side of the Allies. The conflict was now truly global, with major fighting in Europe, Africa, Asia, and across the world's oceans. The industrial might and vast resources of the United States would prove to be a decisive factor in the eventual Allied victory, transforming the balance of power. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved a string of stunning victories. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. They seemed unstoppable as they expanded their empire across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Allied forces in the region were overwhelmed and forced into retreat. However, the United States was rapidly mobilizing its economy and military for war. The sleeping giant, as one Japanese admiral had feared, was now awake. The stage was set for a long and brutal naval and island-hopping campaign across the vast Pacific Ocean to push the Japanese forces back. By the middle of the war, the momentum began to shift in favor of the Allies. Several key battles and events in 1942 and 1943 proved to be major turning points. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a crucial naval victory for the United States. American codebreakers had discovered Japan's plan to attack the island of Midway. The United States Navy set a trap and, in a fierce battle, sank 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers. These carriers were irreplaceable, and their loss crippled the Japanese Navy. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive for the rest of the war. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, fought against the German and Italian forces under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. At the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, the British achieved a decisive victory. This victory stopped the Axis advance towards the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. Shortly after, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Caught between 2 Allied armies, the remaining Axis forces in North Africa were trapped and eventually surrendered in May 1943. This victory secured the Mediterranean for the Allies. The turning point on the Eastern Front was the Battle of Stalingrad. The German defeat there in early 1943 was a disaster from which their army never fully recovered. It not only cost them an entire army, but also shattered the myth of German invincibility. Following Stalingrad, the Red Army launched a series of massive offensives, pushing the Germans steadily westward. The scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front was immense, and it consumed the majority of Germany's military resources. This relentless pressure from the east was vital for the overall Allied war effort, as it tied down hundreds of German divisions. With North Africa secured, the Allies used it as a base to invade Sicily and then mainland Italy in 1943. Italy, the weaker of the main Axis partners, was knocked out of the war, and Mussolini was overthrown. German forces rushed in to occupy Italy and continued to fight a tough defensive campaign. Meanwhile, the Allies began a massive strategic bombing campaign against Germany. British and American bombers attacked German cities, factories, and transportation networks around the clock. The goal was to destroy Germany's ability to produce war materials and to break the morale of the German people, paving the way for the final invasion of Western Europe. The war was not just fought by soldiers on the front lines. It was a total war that deeply affected the lives of civilians in every participating country. The home front became a critical part of the war effort. Governments took control of national economies, directing factories to stop making consumer goods and start producing planes, tanks, and guns. In countries like Britain and the United States, this industrial mobilization was enormous. People were urged to contribute in any way they could, from working in factories to buying war bonds to help finance the conflict. The entire society was organized for a single purpose: winning the war. Rationing was a part of daily life for millions. Governments introduced rationing systems to make sure that scarce goods like food, gasoline, and clothing were distributed fairly. People were given ration books with coupons that limited how much they could buy. They were encouraged to make do and mend and to grow their own food in victory gardens. Propaganda posters were everywhere, encouraging people to work harder, save resources, and keep quiet about sensitive information. The war required immense personal sacrifice from everyone, not just those in uniform, creating a sense of shared purpose and community. Women played a vital new role in the war effort. With millions of men away fighting, women stepped into jobs that had previously been done only by men. They worked in factories building bombers and ships, on farms producing food, and in auxiliary military roles as drivers, mechanics, and clerks. In the Soviet Union, women even served as combat pilots and snipers. This experience changed society's view of what women could do. It gave many women a new sense of independence and confidence, and it laid the groundwork for future changes in women's rights after the war was over. For people living in cities, the war brought the constant threat of air raids. Cities in Britain, Germany, and Japan were heavily bombed. During the Blitz in Britain, German planes bombed London and other cities night after night. People sought shelter in underground stations or in small Anderson shelters in their gardens. The sound of air raid sirens became a familiar part of life. This bombing from the sky brought the horror of the front line directly to civilian populations. It caused massive destruction and loss of life, leaving entire cities in ruins and forever scarring the memories of those who lived through it. By 1944, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. On June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, the Western Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in France. This opened a new major front in Western Europe. After fierce fighting to break out from the beaches, the Allies began to push the Germans back across France. In August, Paris was liberated. At the same time, the Soviet army was continuing its massive advance from the east, pushing into Poland and the Balkans. The German army was caught in a giant pincer movement. The final year of the war in Europe was a period of intense and bitter fighting. Germany launched one last desperate counterattack in the West in the winter of 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, but it failed. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River into Germany, while Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin from the east. As the Red Army fought its way into the German capital, Adolf Hitler, hiding in his bunker, realized the war was lost. On April 30, 1945, he committed suicide. A few days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. This day is known as Victory in Europe Day or VE Day. Even with the war over in Europe, the fight against Japan continued in the Pacific. The United States was closing in on the Japanese home islands, but the fighting was incredibly fierce. Battles on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed that an invasion of Japan would cost a huge number of American lives. To avoid this, the new American president, Harry S. Truman, made a difficult decision. He authorized the use of a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The devastation caused by the atomic bombs was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The two cities were destroyed and tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. Faced with this terrifying new weapon and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Emperor Hirohito decided to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and the formal ceremony took place on September 2nd. This marked the final end of World War II. The world was at peace, But it was a world that had been changed forever by 6 years of terrible conflict. The cost in human lives was staggering, with an estimated 70 to 85 million people dead.